Hello everyone! Welcome to the Arctic Research Consortium of the United States, ARCUS, Arctic Research Seminar. My name is Asma Shitwala, and on behalf of ARCUS, I thank you for joining us. Today's seminar will feature Dr. Larry Hamilton from the University of New Hampshire. Before we begin, we would like to thank the Consortium for Ocean Leadership for providing our venue for today's in-person seminar, and the National Science Foundation Office of Polar Programs for their financial support to ARCUS and this seminar series. For those of you online, you will have the opportunity to chat with the host and other participants, and to submit questions by typing them into the chat pane of your attendee control panel. You may send in questions at any time. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A following the presentation. Webinar attendees also have two viewing options available: gallery view and speaker view. You can switch between those views using the button in the upper right corner indicated by the red arrow. The chat button is also shown here with the green arrow. Okay. Now I would like to welcome today's presenter, Dr. Larry Hamilton. Dr. Hamilton is a professor of sociology and senior fellow at the Carsey School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire. Over the past 25 years, he has studied human-environment interactions around the circumpolar north, from Alaska to Greenland and the northern Atlantic. Much of his research involves collaboration between social and natural scientists to investigate topics such as climate-linked migration in Arctic Alaska, fisheries crisis in Iceland and Greenland, or the accuracy of predictions about sea ice. In addition to research on the Arctic regions themselves, Dr. Hamilton conducts large-scale surveys of public knowledge and perception outside the Arctic. Today, he'll be discussing what people know, asking about the Arctic on U.S. General Public Surveys. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Larry Hamilton. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ashma, and to ARCUS for hosting me today. I am going to be talking about the results of survey research, asking the U.S. general public questions about what they know and imagine about Arctic regions. And it's an unusual organization. It's basically a historical talk, but I'm going to start in the middle, then go back about 13 years and gradually work up to last week. We'll start off with a graph you probably are already familiar with, which is Arctic sea ice extent. The blue bars here are the extent of sea ice at the September minimum each year going back to 1979, the satellite era. And if, whoops. Well, I seem to have lost the, there we go. Okay, I have to be careful with this. No, every time I move it, okay, I'm not going to touch this. The blue bars are the extent of sea ice at the September minimum over the Arctic Ocean, or the Arctic generally. The orange bars are similarly the sea ice extent at the February minimum for the Antarctic. And this goes back to 1979. You'll notice that since 2007, Arctic sea ice minimum extent has been well below anything observed in previous decades. So with the next slide, I'll be asking a survey question that basically asks people to contrast the recent years at the right side of this graph with about 30 years ago, which are the much higher bars on the left. So the question is, which of the following three statements do you think is more accurate? Picture this being read in a telephone survey to a random sample of Americans. Over the past few years, the ice on the Arctic Ocean in late summer covers less area than it did 30 years ago, declined and then recovered to about the same area it had 30 years ago, or covers more area than it did 30 years ago. And the order of those choices would be rotated with interviews. And of course, people can say they don't know. So it's a fairly precise question. You'll notice it specifies the metric, which is area. It specifies the season, which is late summer. It specifies the time period, which is recently compared with 30 years ago. And here's how people answered. This example is from a 2016 nationwide survey called Polls, which stands for something. We got almost 70% accurately responded that the sea ice in recent years covers less area than it did 30 years ago. About 14% thought it might have declined and then recovered to about the same. Only 9% thought it might cover more area, and only 7% said they don't know, which of course is a perfectly legitimate response. Now, in survey research, getting a graph like that is the very first step, but it's not the most interesting one. The most interesting step is when you go beyond that and say, okay, that's what people answered. Now I'm going to ask who answered that. And there are a lot of ways to break that down depending on your survey, your target, your research question. But what you see here is sort of the usual suspects. I always start with these and then go farther. Upper left, you see the percent who accurately reported that Arctic sea ice had declined, broken down by age group from 18 to 29 at the top to 65 plus at the bottom. And there's really not much going on with respect to age. All age groups are about similarly accurate. Very, very weak tendency for younger adults to be more accurate, but not much going on with respect to age and sea ice. At upper right, you see it broken down by males, the blue bar, and females, the red ones. Again, not very much different. Males and females about equally likely to say sea ice had declined. Lower left, you see broken down by education, from high school or less at the top to postgraduate education at the bottom, and there is something happening there. In terms of education, there's about an 18-point difference in accuracy on sea ice between people who have high school or less and people who have postgraduate education. In the latter group, we've got about 74% saying that sea ice is less now. Then at bottom right, you see it broken down by self-identified political party. And there, we see something different. There's a 35-point difference between people who identify as Democrats and those who identify as Tea Party supporters. And that is the elephant in the room. And I do many, many surveys every year looking at lots of different questions, and it's almost always the elephant in the room. And you can avert your gaze from political effects, but they are dominant if you really look at the data. And it's in my view, it would be bad science if I reported on these surveys without telling you about what's really a major structure in all of these data sets. So what does the general public, US public, know or think about the Arctic? Most drivers of Arctic change originate outside of the Arctic, from climate to geopolitics and resource markets and many other things. So public perceptions outside of the Arctic matter in terms of public policy. That very much affects the lives of people in the Arctic. The first systematic nationwide survey that I know of on polar topics was a set of polar module questions that were placed on the General Social Survey. The General Social Survey is National Science Foundation's flagship social science survey. The polar module questions were placed on the GSS in 2006, and again, same questions pretty much in 2010. That design was meant to pick up whether public knowledge and perceptions about the Arctic had changed before and after the International Geophysical Year in 2007, 2008. I'm sorry, not International Geophysical Year, that's an older one. It was the International Polar Year, was 2007, 2008. So one of the questions that was asked in the GSS surveys, 2006, 2010, was, would you say the polar ice caps have gotten larger or smaller over the last 25 years? And 77% said they've gotten smaller. Only 1% said they were the same. That was a volunteered response, and 4% said larger. So at first glance, with the idea that the right answer is they've gotten smaller, you would think the public's doing fairly well. If you look at it more closely, if you met someone argumentative about this, they might object, like, well, what are the polar ice caps? Because, for example, in about this time period, you could argue that sea ice around the Antarctic might actually, if anything, be slightly higher than it had been a little bit earlier. And the mass attrition for Antarctic was not established. It might have been increasing as well. So the question's sort of ambiguous by my standards. However, notwithstanding that, most people said that the ice caps were less. Another of their questions was a true-false question. So these are designed to be knowledge questions. True or false, the North Pole's on a sheet of ice that floats on the Arctic Ocean. And here you see a lot less confidence. Only 41% thought that was true, 23% thought it was false, and 36% just said they didn't know. And then a social Arctic question. Inuit, often called Eskimos, live north of the Arctic Circle. True or false? And only 44 people could confidently answer that that was true, 44% rather. 18% thought it was false, and again, 38% just shrugged and said they don't know. Finally, there were a set of, in addition to the knowledge questions, there were questions meant to assess how concerned people were about changes that might be happening in the Arctic. One of them was worded like this: some predict that global warming may soon have big effects on the polar regions. Would it bother you a great deal, some, a little, or not at all, if sea level may rise by more than 20 feet, flooding coastal areas? Now, you might think everyone would be bothered by that if it happened, but in fact, only about 70% said that would bother them a great deal. Perhaps they're living inland or they don't think it'll happen, I'm not sure. 19% said it would bother them some, 6% little, and 4% not at all. Okay, so I came upon this GISS polar module not as a designer. I had no hand in that, but for me it was sort of found data. I realized they'd done this wonderful study and so far had not done very much analysis with it. So I wrote a paper in 2008 called Who Cares About Polar Regions, that thoroughly analyzed the data from the 2006 Polar Module Survey. The key takeaway in all of this from the first iteration was I was finding in question after question, I was finding that people's political orientation affected how they were answering both the factual and even more clearly the concern questions. And there was a discovery there in that pattern. This graph, which I'm going to refer to it as a megaphone shape, the horizontal axis, the x-axis here, is education, the respondent's education. And the vertical axis is the probability they said they would care a great deal if the sea levels rose 20 feet and flooded coastal areas. And what you see is that for people who self-identify as liberals, the higher their education, the more likely they are to say they care a great deal about flooding. But for people who identify as conservatives, the more educated, the less likely they are to say they would care a great deal. So in this 2008 paper from 2006 data, this was a new discovery, and I wasn't really sure what to make of it. It was definitely there in the data. So we wrote it up and said, well, hey, look at this. This is interesting. After the 2010 repetition of the GSS, some students and I wrote a couple of new papers comparing and contrasting these two mostly identical surveys before and after the International Polar Year. We found that polar knowledge, as measured by the questions on the survey, was slightly higher, not dramatically, but the polar concern had not changed at all. And as I'm going along here, occasionally you'll see the front page of papers. A lot of this stuff has been written up, and I'd invite anyone who wants to email me for copies. I'm happy to share. There are stacks of reports behind what I'm saying here. But about that megaphone, we of course replicated it with a new data set to find out if it was really there, but then went on and tried a variation where instead of using education on the x-axis, we used a science literacy score, because the GSS carried a bunch of questions like true or false and an electron is smaller than an atom that were meant to assess general science literacy. And that gave us an 11-point scale. And if we graphed it against concern about flooding coastal regions, we got the same sort of megaphone that basically among self-identified liberals, the higher their science literacy, the more concerned they were about coastal flooding. Among self-identified conservatives, it went the other way. The more the higher their science literacy score, the less concerned they were about coastal flooding. So, now we have two replications, and it seems like we'd really found something here. It turned out to be replicated on many other surveys. I say today probably 20, 25 different studies have found something like that, not only on polar topics. So it's really there, and it's a feature of American society. But I'm going to shift direction slightly and talk about something else that I felt that I'd learned from the analysis of the polar module questions, and that is that I really like more precise questions. So on the left, you see the GSS question. Would you say the polar ice caps have gotten larger or smaller over the last 25 years? And on the right, you see the question I started out with. Compared with 30 years ago, the area of sea ice on the Arctic Ocean late summer is less, decline and recover more. So the one on the left was the earlier question, sort of the prototype. The one on the right is my version, where I tried to make everything very precise. And the point of doing that was that with the right-hand question, there really is a correct answer that any scientist would agree on. Whereas the left one, somebody could argue, could quibble about, well, do you mean land ice or sea ice? And do you mean the Antarctic or the Arctic, and so forth. But as survey questions, in spite of this big difference in my mind, they behave kind of similarly. So at top, you see the GSS responses, where about 77% said the polar ice caps are smaller. And at the bottom, you see from a 2016 survey, where you have a little bit less than 70% say that the sea ice covers less area in late summer now. So there's some difference there, but not a huge difference. And I learned from this that the precise wording of questions will make small differences, but very often they don't make big differences in how the public responds to a question, whether it's precisely worded or somewhat vague. Here's another comparison question. On the left hand is the general social survey question. The North Pole's on a sheet of ice that floats on the Arctic Ocean. And on the right hand is a question I'd written with three choices. Which best describes the North Pole? Ice a few feet or yards thick over a deep ocean, ice more than a mile thick over land, or a rocky mountainous landscape. So I try to give, there's a clear right answer to that, but I try to make the other answers plausible so that people could look at that and there isn't a clue in the wording, which is right or which is wrong. Here you see the responses to, again, the older question at the top and the newer one at the bottom. 41% thought it was true that the North Pole was on a sheet of ice floating over an ocean. I got actually a majority, 44% thought that the North Pole was on thin ice over a deep ocean, but then 38% thought it was thick ice over land. Now, here's something interesting when you put this together with the question we had a minute ago. So we have about 70% who can accurately say that the area of sea ice on the Arctic Ocean has declined, and yet we have only 44% that know where the North Pole is. And I realized there was an inconsistency there, that people are getting the right answer, it seems, to one knowledge question without actually knowing very much. Even something as basic as that, the thing that we all learn in grade school, that the North Pole is in the middle of an ocean. Incidentally, the same question with identical wording can be asked about the South Pole. And of course, in that case, the correct answer would be ice more than a mile thick over land. And accuracy is not very much better then. Here's another question, my version of the social question. So on the GSS, it was Inuit, often called Eskimos, live north of the Arctic Circle, true or false? My version of this, which country has territory and thousands of people living north of the Arctic Circle? And it's multiple choice. We gave them the choice of the United States, China, Estonia, Britain, or none of these. And the GSS responses are at top. 44% thought it was true that Inuit lived north of the Arctic Circle. The newer survey responses are at bottom, and only 18% of the US respondents realized that the US has territory and people living in the Arctic. 44% thought that was a trick question and that none of the answers were correct. A few people even chose Estonia, which I put on there on the assumption that a lot of Americans didn't know where that was. I think that's probably true if they think it's in the Arctic. Anyway, again, this sort of shows that something different is happening with these questions than with sea ice, that a lot of people are confidently answering sea ice is less, but they don't really have a sense of where the Arctic is. Here's another question, a sort of physical geography question. Which could do most to raise sea level if it melted? Antarctic sea ice, Greenland and Antarctic land ice, or the Himalayan glaciers? And the accurate answer, of course, is the Greenland and Antarctic land ice, which together could raise sea level by more than 70 or 80 meters, whereas all the sea ice could melt and make a very small contribution to sea level. But 41% nevertheless chose sea ice. So, of course, it's floating on the ocean. Maybe it seems like it would raise sea level. Anyway, we're getting this picture of very limited knowledge here, which is a little bit different from what I thought we might find. We ran one of our national surveys with an oversampling of Alaskans to see if they were doing better on these things compared with the lower 49 US states. And in this graphic, the dark bars are Alaska responses, and the light blue bars are people from other states. The top question is sea ice less, and the Alaskans do a little bit better, 83% correct compared with 69. The question about which would do more to raise sea level, again, Alaskans do a little bit better, 44% versus 34. So you're kind of seeing what you might expect here, Alaskans doing better, but it's not a breathtaking difference. Where's the North Pole? Well, 63% of Alaskans had that right, compared with only 43% of other Americans. The striking one to me was the question about whether the US had territory and thousands of people living in the Arctic. Now, only 18% of the general US population knows that the US has territory and people in the Arctic, but only 51% of Alaskans do. And that's quite striking, considering that all of the territory and people are in Alaska. It's maybe less striking if you think that a lot of Alaskans live in Anchorage and Juneau and places in the south and southeast, and perhaps the Arctic is sort of far away. But in any event, Arctic knowledge, even among Alaskans, most of whom live outside of the Arctic, of course, proves rather limited. I've also started asking a series of questions on statewide polls in my home state of New Hampshire. We have a quarterly survey called the Granite State Poll. And for a very low cost, I can put a couple of questions on that every 3 months or so. And this provides a really great way to experiment with new questions and to repeat them if they're interesting and watch for any changes over time. As we've also established, New Hampshire is a surprisingly good proxy for the rest of the US in that responses on the New Hampshire surveys come out within a few points usually of the much bigger and more expensive national surveys. So it's a very cost-effective research vehicle. So here's one question we asked. If the Arctic region becomes warmer in the future, do you think that will have major effects, minor effects, or no effects on the weather where you live? And it looks like about 60% of our New Hampshire residents on this particular survey thought it would have major effects on the weather where we live. And that's fairly consistent. 29% thought minor effects. Almost nobody thought it would have no effects if the Arctic becomes warmer. And of course, in New Hampshire, the weather in question is often the winters, that we get lots of discussion about the polar vortex and nor'easters and big storms. And I think some discussion of the possible connections to polar regions, things like Jennifer Francis's work, are filtering through. So there's some awareness that there might be some connection. And this is what it looks like when we track those sorts of questions over time on the New Hampshire polls. I thought they would be jumping up and down with a big storm, a cold season or a warm season, maybe an election or a new scientific report. But following these things over time, the huge impression is of stability. They don't change very much. The results are very replicable from one season to the next. The top line there tracks the percentage of people accurately answering the question about whether Arctic sea ice was less. Goes up and down with no particular pattern, usually just sort of sampling variation, and it's certainly not improving. The time period here is from 2011 up through the most recent survey, which was just April 2019, just a couple of weeks ago. The middle line here is whether you think Arctic warming will have major effects on the weather where you live. And it's going up a little bit, but the change is not statistically significant, so I wouldn't make very much of that. Again, not dramatic changes, and especially it's not changing in winter or summer, a warm winter or a cold winter. You know, all the things I thought would push it around seem not to. And then the very bottom question is that difficult question about whether what would do the most to raise sea level, where the correct answer would be Greenland or Antarctic land ice melting. And again, you can see, you know, it sort of wanders along there, not really going up or down. So these responses are surprisingly stable, and that's another thing we've discovered. Knowledge is not rising. Okay, but we've learned that there are two kinds of facts. I've hinted at this before. There are facts that can and cannot be guessed from your general beliefs. And the ones that can be guessed from your general beliefs are going to correlate pretty strongly with your politics. And the ones that can't be guessed are going to have fairly weak correlation with politics. So the top two graphs, each of these graphs here, you see one of the percentage of correct responses on one of the Arctic questions, or one of the Arctic change answers, and they are graphed against a four-party political identity scale, ranging from Democrats as the dark bars at top to Tea Party supporters at the bottom. So the upper left graph is the sea ice question. You see a very strong political gradient there. That's about a 35-point gap I led with earlier. Upper right is will Arctic warming have an effect on your weather? And again, a very distinct political gradient. So those are both the kind of question where answers can be guessed from your general political orientation or your socio-political identity. What you believe about global warming whispers in your ear how you should answer that question. And as a result, you see these strong political gradients. On the other hand, knowing whether the North Pole is on land ice or sea ice, your politics don't whisper any clues. They give you no idea at all what the right answer for someone of your identity should be to that question. And one result is that the percent of correct answers is very much lower, and that it doesn't very much correlate with politics. So the center left graph is the percent who got that North Pole question right. There's a very slight political gradient there, but it's not anything like the top two graphs. The center right graph is the same question about the South Pole. Is it on ice a few feet or yards thick over a deep ocean, or is it ice more than a mile thick over land, or is it a rocky mountainous landscape? And again, you don't see much of a political gradient there, because whatever you believe about climate change, it doesn't tell you how to answer that question. Lower left is the sea level question. There's a little bit of a difference there, but it's not statistically significant. In terms of there's not much going on politically with whether you think that Greenland and Antarctica or Arctic sea ice could do more to raise sea level. And finally, at bottom right is the hardest question in this set, which is the question about which of the following countries has territory and thousands of people living in the Arctic. And politics doesn't give you any help with that one either. Nobody gets it right, regardless of their politics. So two kinds of questions, ones that can and cannot be guessed, and by guessed I mean right or wrongly, from your more general political orientation. And particularly in this case, your beliefs about global warming, but we found this applies to other realms as well. Okay, therefore, if I want to measure some kind of like polar science literacy, I should carefully choose the questions that appear to be sort of belief neutral. And the 5 graphs you see, they're the same questions you've already seen. Well, let's see, the one at upper left is what is the meaning of the greenhouse? What do scientists mean by the greenhouse effect? Is it a hole in the ozone layer? Is it, does it refer to the heat trapping properties of certain gases such as CO2? Is it the warming effect of pavement in cities? you know, I always try to make the choices all sound plausible. So it's not one of those multiple choice tests we've all taken where you can kind of guess what the right answer is from the way the question's worded. So yeah, about 64% correctly identified the greenhouse effect as something to do with CO2. Which best describes the location of the North Pole is upper right, then which describes the South Pole, which could do most to raise sea level, and which country has territory and people in the Arctic. With those 5 questions, you can get a 0 to 5 knowledge scale, and that's the little graph at lower right. That is, you know, it's kind of general geographical, mostly Arctic relevant knowledge, all of it directly related to climate change, or relevant to it anyway. And it should be relatively uncontaminated by what you believe about climate change or by your political identity. It should just be, you know, to score well on this, you'd have to know a few things. Some of them people were guessing pretty well, but others, nobody was guessing very well. So we have this 0 to 5 knowledge scale. That was the outcome of this. And then, of course, the thing you want to do with that, or the thing I want to do that as social scientists, is ask, well, who scored well on that test? And how does it correlate with their other beliefs or perceptions? So we're getting closer to the present now. We had a paper last year published in a journal called Climatic Change called Self-Assessed Understanding of Climate Change. And we've noticed on our surveys for quite a while that if you ask people how well they understand the issue of global warming or climate change, that people are remarkably confident that close to a quarter of people, well, a very small fraction, less than 10%, say they understand nothing at all about this, and only a few more people say they understand just a little. A large group, a plurality, says they understand a moderate amount about climate change, and about a quarter of our sample says they understand a great deal. So those of you who are scientists may be skeptical as to whether a quarter of the American public actually understands a great deal about this very technical and complex topic that is absorbing the study of thousands of scientists around the world. But it is striking that a quarter of people think they understand it a great deal. So what we did was start to analyze this sense of understanding in relation to actual knowledge. And again, it turns out to have this sort of complicated relationship. Basically, the question could be phrased, who are these people who understand a great deal, who think they understand a great deal about climate change? And you find that some of those are people who scored 0 on our 5-point knowledge quiz. So there's then some exploration of, well, what do they understand if they don't know where the North Pole is, but they feel that they understand a great deal about climate change? What's the basis of that? And having heard the rest of this talk, you won't be surprised to know that the answer is substantially related to people's socio-political identity. This graphic here, you have the basic knowledge score, that 0 to 5 scale on the horizontal x-axis, and the probability that people say they understand a great deal about climate change is the vertical scale. And what this shows is among Democrats, Republicans, and independents to varying degrees, the higher their knowledge score, the more likely they were to say they understood a great deal about climate change. Now, I should emphasize that even the people who score high on this knowledge scale, probably by a scientist's standards, don't understand a great deal about climate change. I've seen at AGU people presenting quizzes of non-climate scientists to figure out how much they understood about climate change. And some of those results are fun as well. In any event, there's a correlation between objectively measured knowledge and self-assessed understanding among 3 of the political groups, but not among the 4th. The 4th group is drawing its sense of understanding from, not from confidence in their physical world understanding, but from a confidence that it's a hoax, that it's not real, and that is a part of their socio-political identity. So I promised I'd bring this up to last week, and this is actually a report I'm going to be working on the flights home tonight. The New Hampshire presidential primary is, of course, a big feature on the New Hampshire surveys, such as the Granite State Poll, and they just completed a new survey, polling April 10 to 18th, and asked all the usual questions about, are you going to vote in the primary? If so, who are you going to vote for? Do you approve or disapprove of the job the president is doing? Those are their main bread and butter type questions. And I, as always, am sort of piggybacking a few of these science questions onto the poll as well. So here's one of their standard questions. Do you approve or disapprove of the job that President Trump is doing? This is as of 2 weeks ago in New Hampshire. So 40% approved, and 50-some said they disapproved, and about 6% said they didn't know or answered neither. And that's what the political scientists working on the poll will report. But here's Arctic sea ice graphed against that same scale. And what you see is a really strong political gradient in responses about whether Arctic sea ice has declined, being strongly correlated with your opinion about the president. So when I started out early in the talk saying that this is sort of the elephant in the room, you can avert your eyes, but it's there in the data, and it's actually the biggest thing in these data sets. So in my view, you can't not see it, and you can't honestly report on these surveys without talking about the extent to which this underlying dimension structures the way people perceive the physical world in many respects. We've got other things besides the Arctic, but it colors very much what they perceive about the Arctic, even such a basic reality as the decadal decline in Arctic sea ice coverage. So I've mentioned before that this stuff is all written up in a variety of reports from the Carsey School, which I work with, and also in refereed journal articles in many different journals. And if anybody has any questions, I would be happy to, if you can email me and say, you know, where did you get that from? I'd be happy to send those and share them with you. And there's, of course, much more detail about how exactly were these surveys done and what sort of quality checking and how are these analyses controlled and so on and so forth. So please write me if you have those questions. Lower left here, you'll see that a few of these papers have been published in Arcus's own journal, Witness the Arctic, including that graph that compared the Alaska and US perceptions on our Arctic knowledge questions. So that was in, I think, 2017, the May issue of Witness the Arctic. So I'll end with a very non-Arctic picture of my dog and see at this point whether we have any questions about any of this material.
Okay, we'll now take any questions. For those online, you can ask your questions in the chat box, and I'll read those aloud for Dr. Hamilton. Okay, so we have a question from Helen Wiggins. She says, she finds it very interesting. I'm still getting over my shock over the data of Alaskans' knowledge of the Arctic. But what do you think these surveys results tell us about where we should or shouldn't focus our efforts for communication and education about the Arctic?
Okay, well, that's a very good question. I think one of the sorts of things that sort of foot in the door, things that I see is the connection to your nightly weather forecasts. That as TV meteorologists and others become a little bit more aware of all the research about how your local weather has global connections, that this is one way of entering directly into the public discourse. There are a lot of really good websites and resources presented by scientists that people can look for if they're curious, but I think the very first step is getting people curious, getting people interested, and looking outside of the news media they always watch.
That's great. We have another question from Betsy. She says, is the political correlation to Arctic knowledge a function of folks talking to others with the same political orientation? often thought of as an echo chamber?
That is a great question, and we have a paper that just came out last year, and a new one in process right now, where we asked people whether, these are some other surveys, they had nothing to do with the Arctic, but we asked people whether most of their friends belong to the same political party that they do. And we discovered that something larger than something around a third of our sample said yes, most of their friends belong to the same party. And we then discovered that those people had stronger party appropriate views on such basic things as the weather in the region where you live. That was a survey we did in northern New England where the winters have been warming, and some people, many people knew that the winters had been warming because of course the ski areas are closing earlier, gardens blooming sooner and so forth. But some people did not, and we found that having friends of the same political party exaggerated the tendency to get that question wrong. We asked the same, are your friends the same party question on another survey in Oregon, where we asked questions such as what you think should be done about wolves who have been seeping back into the eastern Oregon mountains, and some people would like to see them eliminated. And we found that having same party friends strengthened people's view that wolves should be eliminated. So yes to the first part of that question. There's an echo chamber involving your friends that can intensify partisanship. And second part is that people choose news media that will do the same thing. And believe it or not, we have yet another paper about that.
That's great answer. So we have another question from John Farrell. He asks, many makes the case that to influence political decision makers, we need to do a better job of informing them. Do you think that is indeed the case? Or are their minds already made up based on adherence to values and other factors?
Okay, good question. There's a lot of discussion, as you know, about science communication and how scientists should be doing it better or different or more broadly or whatever. And scientists have largely responded to that. I think a lot of them are making heroic efforts, and there's some people who are real stars in the realm of science communication. And I think that's great. Any of us should in any way we can. But two things. One is, to your question, I think you're absolutely right. A lot of people's minds are made up, and that may be even more true among decision makers or political figures than among the general public. And the second thing is that all the science communication in the world is not speaking into a vacuum, that people are hearing other information. So if I stand up in front of an audience and say, well, Arctic sea ice is declining, there are people there who may think, I'm going to check another source and see if what he said is right. And they know where to go to find a source that say, no, Arctic sea ice is not declining. And so people can, it's a process called motivated reasoning or biased assimilation. You know, if people don't like what they just heard, they know where to go to hear what they do like.
Thank you. So we have another question from Kristin Tim. She asked, have you ever asked any questions on your surveys about media use patterns? I wonder to what extent the use of particular media, especially partisan media, are moderating some of these Arctic beliefs knowledge.
You're absolutely right. They are. And I don't know that I think one of our papers, a 2016 paper called Where's the North Pole? We asked the question, what sources would you trust for information about climate change? And the choices, we said science organizations such as NASA that study the climate, or your friends and family, or political leaders of your party, or religious leaders of your faith, or, you know, and because I sort of knew what was coming, I asked, you know, how about Fox TV News? And the pattern is that the good news is that NASA and science agencies get the highest trust by everybody. But the second highest among conservatives would be Fox News. So, you know, that's sort of the realm that scientific voices are competing in. There can be people who will say sciencey sounding words about why Arctic sea ice is increasing, if that's what you want to hear. And a lot of people know where to go to be told that their prejudices are correct.
Thank you. And we have a question from Jelaine. The Tea Party straight line in your last graph is incredible. But considering the bell curve of science literacy scores, were there really enough of that segment for a reliable plot?
Well, that's a good question. And the short answer is we had about 1,400 respondents for that particular survey, and we're drawing on all of them. And we use statistical techniques that try to take into account whether you've got enough information to draw a particular conclusion. And for that data set, I think the finding's pretty robust. As a scientist, I always wonder, whenever I get anything new and unusual, I wonder, is it real? Will it be there in the next data set I look at? So that's the best data I have on that thing. But I've also run similar questions on the New Hampshire surveys in 2 iterations, one in 2015 and one just in 2017-18. And there's some questions somewhat like that on a national survey we ran in 2011. So that gives me a total of 4 replications. And it turns out that I can find something resembling that effect on all 4 of those completely independent surveys, 2 nationwide and 2 in the state of New Hampshire. So I think there's definitely something there. Though, as you say, at the tails of the distribution, you've got a relatively smaller numbers of individuals, but they do have strong views.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question from Kath. Reminder that Alaska is a huge state. I imagine people from the Arctic, where I'm from, and which is mostly native and democratic leaning, would have a very different response than people from the southern part of the state. I think she's commenting, but if you can respond to her comment.
I think you're absolutely right. And what I would love to do is be able to mount a survey that had a reasonable sampling of responses from northern Alaska, from rural Alaska generally. Here's the thing. There have been a number of surveys done in the Arctic, not just in Alaska, but other places, including Greenland and Canada. But very often, Arctic-focused surveys are only that. They are surveys in the Arctic or a particular region in the Arctic. The thing that I would be interested in doing is running the same exact survey with a large set of Arctic respondents and a large set of people everywhere else in the country, or for that matter in other countries, so that you could compare the responses directly rather than just having a one-off Arctic survey. So the answer to your question is I would love to do that study. I don't have support for it yet, but I'm going to try and put a proposal together in the next year.
Thank you. And we have a question from Davidson. Isn't it a problem that we all move around in our own realm? People also Google information and then end up at Fox News. Not many people have access to scientific publication or research result. And even if they did, it is written in academic language many cannot understand. Should we think about introducing obligatory layman's summaries which are not hidden behind paywalls?
Well, I noticed that a number of journals are doing that, and also NSF grants come with that request to produce a plain language summary of your results, which I think is a good thing. I think it's also a wonderful thing to publish as much as we can as scientists in formats that are not paywalled. Now, the trick with that is that it usually costs money. They usually charge the author themselves to publish in a non-paywalled format. But insofar as we can, I think it's really great to do that. I think it's great also for scientists to take their show on the road, to talk to retirement homes or church groups, or to write blogs or do videos, whatever their talents lead them to do, to try and share the information. And I think a key step in there is to know who the allies of scientists are. And these might include K through 12 teachers, might include retired computer programmers, could be all kinds of different people who have skills or networks or interests that make them receptive to science. And if we can explain to them, in a sense, we empower them to carry that message on to their own networks.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? I think that's it so far.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Within the next few days, today's presentation and recording of today's seminar will be available in our online seminar archive, along with previous Arctic research seminars at the link shown. You can also visit the ARCIS homepage for more information about ARCIS, its programs, and upcoming Arctic-related events. We would also again like to thank the Consortium for Ocean Leadership for providing our venue today. A couple of upcoming webinars that may be of interest include the Arctic Indigenous Scholar Seminar featuring Helen Ederman of Keswick Walrus Commission and Bristol Bay Marine Mammal Council. This seminar will be held next Monday, May 6th at 8 a.m. Alaska time, 12 p.m. Eastern time at the U.S. Global Change Research Program Office here in Washington, D.C. Registration for both the in-person and webinar portion of that seminar is available on the Indigenous Scholars website. In-person registration for this seminar is required 24 hours in advance of the seminar. The Sea Ice Prediction Network Phase 2 will also be hosting a webinar next Tuesday, May 7th at 10 a.m. Alaska time, 2 p.m. Eastern time. That webinar will feature Ron Kewak from NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, along with others from ISAT-2 team. They will also be discussing some of the early results of ISAT-2 project. Registration is available on the Sea Ice Prediction Network homepage shown here. We're always working to improve our seminar series, as well as looking for suggestions for future seminar topics and speakers. For those of you online, a link to our survey is available in your chat window. This link will also be provided to all attendees in the follow-up email that you will receive once this seminar has been posted to our archive. Thank you again to Dr. Hamilton for speaking today, as well as all of you for joining us. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.